All right, welcome back to part 4 of today's lecture series, The Natural World. In this case, I'm going to be moving from the public sphere and thinking about the ways that we've seen both cooperation and competition with the natural world as important themes in sort of construction of identity, even on a political scale, and moving into the private sphere and looking at the way this works in houses, something you've already hopefully started to do with your assignments for this week. Um, when we look at Roman houses, the garden is a sort of indispensable part of a Roman household. Not in a literal sense that like all Roman households had gardens, because of course some of those upper story insula tiny apartments probably did not. But still the sort of idea of a house in the Roman mind had a garden attached, at least some little plot of growing space and land. And we can see that in another little clip here from Pliny's Natural History. This is a section of his book where he's really talking about planting practices and cultivation at home. And he actually takes some time out to discuss the fact that it's a bit of a confusing line, actually. He talks a little bit about the fact that these city plebs, the plebs urbana, used to have images of gardens daily that they could see before their eyes. And this seems to either refer to perhaps like a window box garden or even just a painting of a garden. There's some debate about precisely what Pliny is discussing here, but nonetheless, there is this idea that even the poorest of households, that Pliny is using the sort of urban poor in this case as a stand-in for that, has some sort of garden feature in the household to bring the countryside, to bring the rural world into urban space. So if we look at our sort of typical house plans that we've seen here, we have a road. The early form of the atrium house often had this sort of rear garden, the hortus being the Latin, one of the primary Latin words for garden, at the back. Then we see that develop a little bit later into these peristyle gardens where we have more usually intimate entertainment spaces arranged around this sort of enclosed colonnaded garden patch at the back of the house. So a bit of an expansion of the hortus space. And then we see over time the development of these sort of villa-style houses, which I will be discussing more in depth in the next lecture. So for now, I want to start by looking at a sort of more rustic house, not rustic, it's in the middle of the city, it's in the middle of Pompeii, as we can see, it's right here. But a little bit of a less elite structure. And this is a domestic space, an inn, so a public and domestic space, right? Somebody's household that is also operating as an inn where you can go and stay. And we have, again, this sort of blank facade with windows that are only very high up, so very insulated from the streetscape itself. And then as you move into this space, what you see first is the countertop as you enter. So we have our little shelves, and then we have the sort of hot food dispensary area here at the counter. And then just behind the countertop, you can see it through the window here, and a larger picture here, is a little dining area set aside inside the house. And this space is open roofed. So we have like a little bit of a courtyard, little bit of a garden space, even in this urban house that does not have the property space to have a sort of large exterior garden of the hortus or peristyle type. Here we have a little dining area that is open roofed, and then it's difficult to see because it's somewhat poorly preserved, but all around the sides of this dining area we have garden paintings to evoke the idea of being outdoors in space. With the blue atmospheric background like we saw at Prima Porta. We see fountains, we see plants growing up lushly around the bases of these fountains. This little cross hatching that we can see here is another one of those wicker fences like we saw at Prima Porta, rendered a little bit more schematically in this case, as is much of these garden paintings being somewhat not in an imperial context, an emperor's household. So we have a little bit more of a casual, quick painting style here that we see. So just to use that as a little bit of a jumping off point to talk about the fact that garden imagery and gardens themselves and open roofed spaces are really important to Roman domestic space. These courtyards that we've talked about, the atrium as a circulatory space and an activity area, really form the heart of the household. So we're sort of enclosed from the street, but open to the sky at the heart of the house, even when that house is a semi-commercial space of a somewhat more less elite standard. If we look at a more wealthy household, this is the house of Octavius Cordio or of Laureus Tiburtinus at Pompeii. It's located quite near the amphitheater at the corner of the city here. And if you outline the property, you can see it here. We have this atrium house, and then attached is this enormous garden space that takes up almost the entire city block. So this property owner seems to have been a freedman. So this house has often been interpreted by scholars as a sort of, through that Trimalchio lens, through that idea of the wealthy freedman type who perhaps can't afford a real country seat and a real countryside house. So instead he builds a sort of fake miniaturized version of a country house that is still in the cityscape. So there's a little bit of perhaps pretension sometimes in the way that this household is discussed by scholars, but I want to talk a little bit more about it as a sort of transitional space as we get towards the villa that really emphasizes the importance of green space as an ideal part of any Roman household. The best household will be one that has extensive outdoor space that is private for the use of household members and their guests. So if we look more closely at the house of Octavius Cordio here, here's another version of the plan. So you can really just see how much this garden area dwarfs the actual architecture of the household itself. And this right now, you can see a view. This is a view from standing where our letter I is here on the plan, looking out towards the rear wall of the garden. And you can just see how extensive this space is and the way that it has been arranged to integrate this central canal with a water feature that is T-shaped. So it runs also to either side of where we are standing in this photograph. And then lined with sort of flanking elongated rows of vegetation, which again draws your eyes and elongates the view, making this seem like an even larger outdoor space than it actually is, although it is quite impressive in terms of the amount of geographic space the owner of this house has been able to take up. If we look at some more spaces in the house, here we can see a view of the atrium. So it's got that sort of traditional atrium plan with rooms off to the side. Here's the central doorway leading out to the street. But you can see that the impluvium itself has also been altered somewhat so that it is bordered by another planter. So the pool at the center is bordered on all sides by plantings that would then be beneath the open roof in the original construction. So even sort of in the atrium center here of this house, we have again that emphasis on garden space. The owners seem to really like having an integration between architecture and natural growing elements within this household. And then this is sort of same spot looking in the other direction out towards the garden again and towards some of the rooms that are arranged around this little courtyard area and seem to have been used for entertainment purposes as they are highly decorated and very beautiful. And if we turned, say, walked to the edge of this portico here and turned to our left, what we would see is this outdoor dining area. So we have one of the T-shaped parts of the canal here running right up to this masonry couch, which is set against the far wall. Here we have an enormous painting of a hunt scene. And then up towards the front of the canal, flanking your dining couches, so you can see reclining areas here and here, we have this fake grotto with pumice stones actually sort of glued in place, attached by masonry, in place at the along this little niche area to make it look like a bit of a natural grotto. And that would be a fountain feature, so sending water into that canal between the dining couches here. And then we have these two paintings flanking either side of the grotto here that I'm going to look at a little bit more closely. On the left, we have an image of Narcissus, and on the right, we have an image of Pyramus and Thisbe. And both of these are interesting mythological scenes that take place in a natural landscape. We don't see so much that dwarfing of figures that we saw in the third style because these are a little bit later fourth style paintings. But we see an emphasis on stories that show some of the dangers of going out in the natural world and outside the house. So with Narcissus, he falls in love with a reflection of himself in a pool. Finds himself unable to move, basically starves to death and turns into his namesake flower. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale about vanity that takes place out in the natural world in this case. And then with Pyramus and Thisbe, this is a sort of an early tragedy of two lovers who are supposed to meet. And then there is this lion that's very faint in the background here and a cloth. And through some misunderstandings, one of them gets eaten by the lion. And it's a tragedy. But so again, that sort of nature as a little bit of a dangerous place to be out with, and myth as a way of expressing that danger in a way that is just removed enough from actual daily life to be able to express those ideas somewhat safely. If we look all the way down at the other end of this porticoed area, looking out on the garden at the back of the house of Octavius Quartio, so if we just stood here and turned a 180, in the distance we would see these two mythological paintings as well, sort of opposite. And these two, again, emphasize that danger of the natural world through mythological storytelling that we've seen at the other end of the portico. On the left, we have an image of the goddess Diana. She's recognizable partly by her headdress as well as the context here. And she is naked and bathing and looking up very shocked at someone who might be, say, entering the doorway into this little entertainment space here. And on the other side, we have the figure of Actaeon. So Diana and Actaeon being an important mythological tale where he, as a hunter, stumbles upon her bathing in the woods. And as a virgin goddess, her revenge is to turn him into a stag. If you look closely, you can actually see he's got little stag horns here. And then he is attacked and torn apart by his own dogs. So in this case, a sort of a cautionary tale even about thinking perhaps that you have too much control over the natural world, that you are the hunter, and very easily able to become the hunted if you just cross the path in the wrong way in the forest and perhaps run across a goddess and make her angry. So here we are out in the garden of the house of Octavius Quartio. We have a little pavilion here. Our outdoor triclinium is over here. Our Diana and Actaeon are over here. So the emphasis in this house is very strongly on a sort of naturescape over a more urban space, and a use throughout the house of associative readings of art to kind of create a really interesting liminal zone in which mythological danger stories can kind of play out around you and surround you in that visual culture. To leave this house a little bit behind, but show you just one more example of a way in which the natural world shows up in decorative space in the private sphere. This is a very famous floor mosaic that is from the Aventine Hill in Rome. It's called the Unswept Floor Mosaic, and it's supposedly after a Hellenistic Greek painting. But I'll leave that aside because where we find them is in Roman households. And here we see the sort of detritus left over after a really luxurious feast. We've got fish, we've got shellfish, we've got bones, shells, snail shells, some vegetation, some nuts, and chicken foot here. So sort of a feast that draws on all different natural available food sources, both exotic and local. And then if we look at another piece of this mosaic, there's also this wonderful little detail of a mouse coming up to a chestnut. So a representation of a living creature that has entered into this domestic space, into the sort of abundance after the feast for some creature like a mouse, and is taking advantage of the sort of human ability to harness a lot of resources from nature and use them to create a sort of luxurious dining experience. But there's this entering of an actual natural feature who has its own agency here as well. So what I want you to do now is to just put on your thinking caps and imagine your Pompeian house and just list 3 elements of nature. Can be an animal, a weather, a kind of plant that might grow here that might enter into your chosen Pompeian house just at any time. They don't always have to be there. And I'll see you in the next lecture.